Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome both the live audience and our online audience to the first presentation in Texas Tech Law's new Energy Law Lecture Series. This is a creation that we've developed because we know how important energy is to our state and region and how important it is to students in our law school here. We know that many of you hope to practice in that area, and we want to bring you interesting, unique speakers to add to what you learn inside of the classroom. We're also hoping to benefit our alums and friends who are interested in energy law by broadcasting this out live for CLE credit and also recording it so that it can be watched later for CLE credit. If there are attorneys here who need CLE credit, there's a sign-in sheet with Corey Clem in the back. For those of you online who may need CLE credit, please email Corey, Corey.Clem, C-L-E-M, at ttu.edu, and she can help you facilitate your CLE credit. One other housekeeping measure is that we're very glad that our speaker today has agreed to do a book signing afterwards. There's a table out in front of the Lanier Auditorium where you can buy the book, and after the presentation, Russell Gold will be signing books, which is quite a treat. It is now my pleasure to introduce someone who's actually going to then introduce our guest speaker today. In April, Professor Bill Keffer joined us here at Texas Tech Law. He is teaching oil and gas and legislation. He was a practicing attorney in Dallas, wearing a variety of different hats. He practiced with large law firms, with his own law firm, and he was also a member of the Texas State Legislature. I was very glad to be able to attract him here to help continue building our energy law holdings. He's also going to serve as the director of our new Energy Law Lecture Series. Bill, welcome to the podium.
Well, thank you, Dean Dickerson. It's quite a thrill to see a full room, and Russell, I'm sure they're here to see you, but how about that Chick-fil-A? We're glad to have you here. This is an exciting time for the law school, not only because of what's happening in the oil and gas industry, but what's happening with the oil and gas curriculum here at the law school. So as part of that development, as Dean Dickerson referenced, we are starting this Energy Law Lecture Series, and we're very excited to have as our feature kickoff speaker, Russell Gold. Before I introduce him, let me just give you an overview statement that probably summarizes all of the statistics that would otherwise cause you to glaze over. As of today, Monday, September 22nd, 2014, the oil and gas industry represents 1/3 of the gross state product in the state of Texas. And when you stop and think about how Texas, were it an independent country, let's just stop and reflect on that for a moment, but if we were an independent country, we would be the 14th largest economy in the world. So the oil and gas industry is 1/3 of the 14th largest economy in the world, which in my book means it's a pretty big deal. Russell Gold is senior energy reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and he has been with the Wall Street Journal since 2000. He's been writing on energy topics since 2002. He was part of the Wall Street Journal team that reported on the Deepwater Horizon incident in the Gulf of Mexico, and as a result of that reporting, their team received the Gerald Loeb Award for Best Business Story of the Year, and they also were a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in National Reporting. Russell Gold has also just recently written and published a book called The Boom, How Fracking Ignited the American Energy Revolution and Changed the World. As Dean Dickerson said, he'll be outside after the lecture to sell and sign his books. So we're glad you're here. We're awfully glad that Russell Gold is here to kick off this program. Please help me welcome Russell Gold.
Well, thank you for all coming out. I want to introduce myself first. And you've got the basic biography, but since many of you are in law school and obviously hoping to go out and find a job, when I was assigned in 2002 to cover the oil and gas industry, I was sort of the low man on the totem pole. We had about 3 or 4 reporters with more seniority above me, and the new hire gets the small companies that no one really cared about. They don't give you Exxon and Chevron. They give you these companies like Devon and Apache and Anadarko, which have subsequently gotten quite big. But at the time, these were sort of the mid-cap energy companies. And you know, sometimes it's really better to be lucky than smart, because I didn't seek them out, and these were the exact companies in 2002 were just about to start fracking and change the world and change the industry. And so, you know, as you're going out and finding jobs, sometimes you'll find yourself being assigned to something you don't quite think is really the heart of the action, and maybe you'll get lucky. So, just to sort of establish how long I've been doing this, in 2003, Devon Energy gave me a tour of their holdings in the Barnett Shale. So I saw my first frac job over 10 years ago. And I got a great tour guide that day, a guy named Jay, and he had been working in the area for a while. And a few years later, I bumped into him again, and his name was Jay Ewing, and we were talking, and I said, well, what's your middle initial? And he said, yeah, it's R. So my J.R. Ewing. Now, I hope some of you will get the reference, but for those of you who don't, I've got a more youthful reference coming up in a minute. So, all right, let's see how this works. So, really beginning in the 1980s, right until the boom begins and fracking really begins, and I'll explain a little bit about that, what that is. U.S. oil and gas development was really driven by two things. You had Alaska, which they find, and Deepwater Gulf of Mexico. That's really, in the 20 years before this current boom, drives U.S. oil and gas exploration. And really the notable things about these, about Alaska and the Gulf of Mexico, is where they are. Dead Horse, Alaska. It is really, it's well above the Arctic Circle. It was a small native community, but essentially at this point it's a city that exists to serve the North Slope. Gulf of Mexico, you're out way past, these big floating rigs, you're out past the horizon. Nobody lives there, basically, is my point. And that's a really big difference from what we're seeing right now. So, I'm sorry, I wanted to throw this in. I should have put this in one before. So this was actually taken this weekend. I was at the Texas Tribune Fest, and I just, to tease your professor, Bill Keffer, a little, that's his brother on the far end. That's me on the far left, and his brother on the far end there. He's chair of the Texas House Energy Committee, so you know, it runs in the family. And you know, I put this up. I actually took this photo from Christy Craddock's Twitter feed. Now, Christy Craddock, right next to me, she is the chairman, and she actually goes by chairman of the Railroad Commission, the oil and gas regulators. And it's nice to see that even oil and gas regulators like to play with their Instagram feeds and the different filters, because she makes it look like this is from the 1980s. So anyway, let me go back to oil and gas production. So the dark green here is your basic lower 48 production. And this only runs through, it says 99, but it's actually 2000. And then Alaska comes on, and then Gulf of Mexico in the gray. So what you can see is, up until 2000 or so, these new areas of oil and gas exploration came on, and you know, they didn't actually increase the overall U.S. production. They just sort of stemmed the decline. We were going into a decline. We had been drilling oil and gas wells really since 1910, 1909, Spindletop. And we were in this long-term decline. We were importing more and more oil, and these distant oil fields that were discovered were great, but essentially they weren't turning things around. So, then that really begins to change. And right about, so this is, this is Nick Steinsberger. Most people, I wrote about him in the book, most people don't know who he is. He's still very much alive. He's still very much active in the oil and gas industry. I am amazed that he has not been given some sort of Presidential Medal of Honor, at the very least, whatever the equivalent is here in Texas. He was the young engineer who back in 1998 was working for George Mitchell, and he was the completion engineer for George Mitchell's Barnett Shale, or North Texas properties. Completion engineer basically means that he designed, after the well had been drilled, he designed how to finish it, how to finish and get the well moving as quickly as possible, or with as much production as possible. So he goes, and the Fort Worth community of engineers was really tight. They would go out and golf. They would go and have barbecue and beer. They all knew each other. And Nick had heard from some folks working at Union Pacific Resources, now I believe part of Anadarko. I can never remember who bought them. He had heard from them some stuff they were doing out in East Texas. Big, massive water fracks. But what they were working on in East Texas were sandstones. Porous rock, easy to work on. And he thought to himself, what if we could do the same with the incredibly dense shale rock in North Texas? Because George Mitchell and Mitchell Energy, they were running out of gas. They knew that. They had been drilling that property for 30 years. So he goes to his bosses and says, let me just try this new way of completing the wells to see if we can get the Barnett Shale to give up some of its gas. We know it has gas, but let me see if I can do that. And he gets permission for 3 wells, and he does what's called screening them out. In other words, he's putting sand in to try to prop open the fracks once he creates them, and the sand ends up clogging up the well, and he basically loses the well. So he goes back down to his bosses in Houston and says, give me 3 more. And the 4th one he screens out again. The 5th one, he finally manages to get the water down. He actually creates fractures, and when they clean it up, it is by far and away the best well George Mitchell's ever drilled into the Barnett Shale, and it begins everything that we're living through right now. And you can sort of draw a direct line from what he accomplished in June of 1998 to why there's 33% of the gross state product now oil and gas, and why many of you, I'm assuming, are interested in oil and gas law, because it starts off the boom. And what's interesting here, so let me see if I can get this going. So this is Fort Worth area, and those black dots are the vertical wells drilled in 1997. And if I can get this going, because I wanted to sort of bring you back, and I'm going to get to, because there's a very definite legal issue coming up here. But remember, Dead Horse, Alaska is an hour north of the Arctic Circle, Gulf of Mexico. I mean, this is Gulf of Mexico way off. And then look what happens here, because this is Fort Worth. This is one of the largest cities in Texas. So, all right, hold on. They've got a mouse I'm not used to here. Oh, there's a beautiful time lapse here if I can figure out how to make it work. Aha. Unfortunately, come on. All right, well, unfortunately, it doesn't seem... Oh, there it goes. Bit by bit. Usually just, I see what it wants me to do. It wants me to manually advance this. Okay, so by 2002, they're starting to expand. They figured out how to do this, and you're starting to see the first couple red wells. Red is where they go down vertically. They turn it horizontally. So I'm just going to click through here because what happens next is pretty phenomenal. 2003, 2004. And they're starting to explore down here in Johnson County. They're starting to creep into Fort Worth proper. Here we go. All of a sudden, horizontal wells are everywhere because they've basically cracked the code. They figured out how to do this. So think about this for a second. I don't want to go too far because I don't want to start this over again and have to go through this whole... All right, well, anyway, I'm not going to do that again. But think about everyone who lives in that area. That's a couple million people in the suburbs. Johnson County is a main suburb. These wells were everywhere there. The nature of the boom right now is that you have to drill lots and lots of small wells to get it out, because fracking, to get the oil and gas out, because fracking doesn't open up some giant reservoir. It stimulates a small portion of reservoir, a few hundred feet of rock, to get the oil and gas out. You can't drill a single well way out in the Gulf of Mexico and get 25 or 50,000 barrels a day. That's not how fracking works. So last year I crunched the numbers for an article in the Wall Street Journal. Johnson County, as you can see right up there, that is the suburbs. That's Cleburne, Texas, just south of Fort Worth, had 20 wells in 2000. By 2013, it had 3,900 wells. So, you sort of have your before and after there. 99.5% of the 150,000 people who live in Johnson County live within a mile of a well. And that's where the legal issues start really coming into place. Because all of a sudden, you're going to have new areas like Johnson County, like big swaths of Pennsylvania, like South Texas, the Eagle Ford Shale, where people are now living close to wells. We called it energy in our in your backyard, in our backyard. People are living close to wells, and often they're not accustomed to it. And that's where we begin to see some very significant legal issues. So, going back, if you remember the graph I showed you before, how it was in decline. Now take a look at what fracking does, the tight oil or the shale. This is oil production. That's the orange bar right there. In the last few years, it just jumps right up. We end the decline. We start producing a lot more oil. And really, depending on how long this boom has and how much legs it has, we could actually be producing more in a few years than what we did in 1970 at our peak. It's really phenomenal. And so there's this huge momentum that builds. Politicians love it because they can start talking about energy independence. They can start talking about they don't need to be so reliant on overseas nations anymore. Whole different approach to foreign policy you can start thinking about. States are getting incredible severance taxes. I think we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar surplus for the Texas legislature coming into this year. And some people who are living there love it too. I mean, think about a rancher in South Texas who was scraping out a living and had a couple thousand acres and had the mineral rights to a couple thousand acres. They were leasing acres in a hot play was going for $10,000 or $20,000 per acre. All of a sudden, you had huge amounts of money. And, if you owned the mineral rights, you were okay with it. But not everyone did. So, let me take you back here. This is Burke Burnett, Texas, in 1918. The classic boomtown. In fact, when Hollywood sets off to make a movie about two wild cows, Clark Gable and Spencer Tracy, they were sort of start from nothing, they build a fortune, they're wildcatters turn tycoons, and they fall for the same woman, Claudette Colbert. It's a decent movie if you like Hollywood movies from 1940, but it's actually set in Burke Burnett, because that is the classic boomtown. And in fact, I actually found this out just a couple days ago. The high school football team in Burke Burnett are called the Bulldogs, and the dance team are called the Boomtown Babes. So, it's still part of their heritage. In 1919, an itinerant worker moves into Burke Burnett looking for work in the oil fields. His name is Otis Grimes, Otis with 2 T's. He buys his home, a 4-room frame house, small lot. But there's a catch. The guy who sold it to him actually worked for Magnolia Oil, which later became part of Exxon, and split the estate. Sells him the surface rights, doesn't sell him the mineral rights. A few days after the sale, he moves in with his family and his kids, and Goodman Drilling shows up. And when I say shows up, this is not, they were the next block over. They put a several hundred-pound steam engine within inches of his front stoop. They had a slush pit full of sort of this very foul-smelling drilling mud right by his back window. He could not talk to his wife in his house anymore because it was so loud. They had to yell at each other. And so Otis Grimes decides he's going to sue. He said, "It's ridiculous. You've destroyed my domestic bliss." So he brings a lawsuit in Wichita Falls. And actually was able to get the original lawsuit pulled because there's this great judge there whose name I believe is Barney Fudge, which you cannot make this kind of stuff up. I'm serious. When I called him and told him I was working on the book, he went in, he got his people to go in, and they pulled out the original and scanned it. It was wonderful. But the judge back in 1919 was not so kind to Otis Grimes. And so they litigate it. And the question is did Goodman Drilling essentially destroy his domestic bliss? And the judge rules in favor of the drillers. And so then Grimes appeals to a court in Fort Worth where they also say he's out of luck. And the quote was that Otis Grimes is in no position to complain of conditions, such as are as usual and customary during the drilling of an oil well. So this is Grimes v. Goodman. This sets the basis in Texas for why you have a dominant mineral estate versus a surface estate. This is where it all comes from. And it's an amazing story. So Otis Grimes loses the lawsuit, bails out, goes back to, or moves down to the Rio Grande Valley to raise dairy cows, actually. But the precedent stays. And it changes over time. I mean, it's not quite as draconian as the 1919 ruling. But this is really what sets in motion most of the 20th century Texas exploration, because the courts consistently say if you have the mineral rights, you have the right to go in and drill the oil and gas. And eventually you have to make certain accommodations, but this really encourages and allows the boom. So when I was in 2003, 2004, I was working on my first Barnett Shale store, and I'm driving around, and one of the first things the person said to me was, a couple of years ago, when you bought land, you got the mineral rights, no question. That's no longer the case. This was back in 2003, 2004. People were beginning to hold on to their mineral rights. They realized something was going on. So fast forward to 2013, there was actually an article in Reuters that found that D.R. Horton, which is the largest U.S. home builder, was holding on to mineral rights in North Carolina, in Alabama, Mississippi, Virginia, New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, Oklahoma, Utah, Idaho, Texas, Colorado, Washington, and California. Pretty much everywhere where they were building new subdivisions, they were not selling the mineral rights anymore. They were holding on to it. That was just going to be, well, we're not quite sure what D.R. Horton's going to do, but you can sort of imagine. They're going to hold on to it and hope that maybe in 10 or 20 years someone figures out a way to exploit what's under there. 10,000 lots is what the article said, and it's probably gone up since then. So you're beginning to see this world in which there's a whole lot of split estates going on. And from Otis Grimes' day on, problems with the split estates. Homeowners who are not happy. And you put that against the backdrop of the fact that the current boom, what's driving all this enthusiasm and all this oil and gas, is drilling thousands and thousands of wells scattered across entire counties, covering entire counties. So you kind of begin to see the potential for problems. So, this is lovely Berthold, Colorado. As you can see, a very nice weekend house that belongs to this gentleman right there. And right in the back is a drilling rig. Well was drilled and later fracked. Now, what's interesting about this is that that gentleman is Jared Polis. He's a member of Congress. He's actually the wealthiest member of Congress, which is saying something. He represents Boulder, Colorado. So as you can imagine, he's a Democrat. That's his weekend house. His father-in-law and sister-in-law actually lived there. And while this was all perfectly legal, the company that drilled that well didn't notify him. He finds out, he's walking the halls of Congress doing whatever congressmen do, and he gets a call from his father-in-law, who, as you can imagine, is pretty irate, saying, what's going on? They're erecting a drilling rig 100 feet away or 200 feet away from our back deck. I mean, this is the very definition of stirring up a hornet's nest. And while there's some companies out there that are very good about this, and will make sure that all the neighbors know, and in fact will have community meetings, etc., there's some companies that don't. And so what this company did, which was a U.S. division of an Australian company that I had never even heard of, is that they stirred up this hornet's nest. And Jared Polis gets onto the ballot an initiative. Colorado is very big on ballot initiatives. They're actually even bigger than California. And essentially runs a one-man campaign, this is just going on, to try to get lots of changes. The White House had to intervene because he was threatening, what he was doing was making the Democrats so unpopular that Senator Udall was going to lose his seat and they were going to lose the Senate. The White House had to come in and eventually get him to pull his ballot initiatives back, and there were various compromises made that we know of, and probably some favors to him that we don't know about yet. So, you know, this is what happens when a well-financed, politically connected person is upset because they're drilling a well in his backyard. But this is going on all over the place. So, one of the things we begin to see floating about are these nuisance lawsuits. Now, Polis, this is all perfect, once again, this is all perfectly legal. What Sundance Exploration did when they drilled that well was completely above board and completely illegal, but yet it didn't really matter because it still stirred up the hornet's nest. Now, Polis had the power to raise a ruckus, and he did. Others didn't. But no one really, they didn't have, Polis didn't have a strong legal case. He didn't have a legal case to say you shouldn't be doing that, that's too close, et cetera, et cetera. It was all within the state rules. It was just the problem is that he did not own the mineral rights across the way. He actually owned the mineral rights on his property, but not 200 feet away. Now, a lot of people don't own the mineral rights where they live, and they're beginning to come up with these nuisance suits. We're starting to see them more and more. The one on the bottom, the last time we were together, had just been, the jury had just ruled on this. Wise County couple wins $2.9 million jury award. These are nuisance. These are, I can't live, this is Otis Grimes. This is the ghost of Otis Grimes rising up from his grave. I can't live there. It's too loud. I'm getting nosebleeds. I'm getting headaches. And they're starting to win. So, what's the future? There's clearly a big anti-fracking movement going on out there. And I bring that up mostly because it's making it more difficult, and I'll get back to this, but it's making it more difficult for oil and gas companies to come to an understanding with the neighbors. So one possibility, one thing that may happen, is that fracking gets pushed off into parts of the country and parts of communities which have less socioeconomic power. Not in Jared Polis's backyard, not in the suburbs of Denton, where there's a ballot initiative right now, or actually in Denton itself, not in the suburbs of Denver. And there actually there's a new associate professor at West Virginia, just finished up his PhD at Princeton in the spring, and his PhD thesis was studying exactly that, the connection between how communities respond to fracking, or at least the community power structure, and socioeconomic status. And he found very clearly, he studied this in New York, that the higher your socioeconomic status of a community is, the more wealthy, the retirees, the people who moved out of New York City because they wanted a nice piece of land in the country, the more chance that they were going to be opposed to fracking. And the lower, is not surprising, the lower socioeconomic status, working farms, etc., they're more receptive to that. But that's one possibility of where we might head, I feel. The debate in communities is often framed in terms of the quality of life, the number of trucks. It takes thousands of trucks to run a single frac operation, how close you are to emissions. But underlying this question is a basic legal question. Who controls where you can frac and how much you can frac and what time of day you can frac? Is it the state? Right? In Colorado and Texas and elsewhere, state constitutions clearly spell out that the regulation of oil and gas is a matter for the state. Colorado, I keep coming back to Colorado because there's a lot of activity, a lot of friction on this right now, much more than in Texas. The state clearly feels we are the ones who get to control this. But City Hall begs to differ. The city says, well, wait a second, we have rights over zoning, or zoning is one of our core functions. So we're going to go in and say, if you tell us we can't ban it, we're just going to zone it. And we're going to say, okay, you can't do it here. This is not zoned for an industrial. This is a residential. So we're going to push it. We're going to have a 2,000-foot setback. So basically, there's like one corner where you can frack. And then, of course, I'm being a little cheeky here, but then you got the federal government and the EPA involved in all this. Texas regulators absolutely fear. It's a great talking point for them. The EPA coming in and telling them what to do. But it's very possible that they might. They are very interested in at least setting rules for the states to say, okay, this is what you need to do, this is what best practices are. The trend has clearly been in favor, believe it or not, of the cities. So you look in Pennsylvania, where this was a sort of a fascinating situation that happened. Pretty clear what the rules say. This is before the Wren's #1 well was drilled in 2003. That was sort of the well where they figured out, hey, you can frack in Pennsylvania and you can come up with this great gas out of the Marcellus. Turns out the Marcellus is the biggest single gas basin in the world, which is pretty remarkable. It's saying something. So pre-Marcellus, here's what it said. All local ordinances to regulate operations are superseded by the state. State's got the power. Don't worry about it. We're in control of this. 2009, the Supreme Court prohibits local ordinances that impose undue restrictions, essentially. So, as you can imagine, some of the locals are not too happy about this. The legislature passes Act 13, severely restricting municipal authority. So the state is really pushing. They're getting jobs, and you've got the whole heartland, the middle of the state, and the western part of the state, which have been in tough economic times, are just booming. So that's Act 13. All settled. State's going to run this. Localities can't do anything. So you can imagine localities sue, and they win. State Supreme Court rules that the state preemption is unconstitutional. And in a rare bit of political honesty, the author of Act 13 goes to his Facebook and says, "We won, I can't believe it, we actually won," and then takes it down a few minutes later, but it had gotten around. So, surprise. But this is the trend, is that states are getting a little constrained here. And so we have this in Denton. Denton's considering an outright ban. I'm not sure who or what will sue Denton, but if Denton passes by ballot initiative a ban, I am sure that someone like Texoga, the Texas Oil and Gas Association, will come in and try to sue it. I heard the mayor of Denton talking over the weekend in Austin, and was talking a lot about how Denton faces this unprecedented situation where you have urban, suburban communities and drilling going on in that. And I kept thinking to myself, Denton's a great town, and there's plenty of reason just to live your life in Denton, but if you just drive down the interstate just a little bit, you get to Fort Worth. And Fort Worth has been through this. They, in fact, started about 2001. Coming up with new sets of rules. And there's quite a bit of urban drilling that goes on in Fort Worth. Some of you may be from Fort Worth or drive through it and you're familiar with it. You see it. Not so much anymore because gas prices are really low, but there are wells throughout Fort Worth. And so one of the interesting things I found out in reporting the book was that I remember talking to the city attorney. I don't know if she's still the city attorney, but she was back then, named Sarah Fullenwider, I believe. And she told me, she was actually from North Carolina. She had no experience with oil and gas law before this all starts. But she said the thing that really struck her was that when they sat down to start coming up with the rules, and the setbacks, and what it needed to look like, everyone was sort of strangely cooperative. Now, granted, this was Texas. People were inclined and accustomed to a certain level of oil and gas development. But they were able to work out a system where it was, you couldn't be within so many feet of a school, and you couldn't be so many feet of, and if you were this close to a house, you had to notify them, et cetera, and when you were done, you had to put up this walls around it that basically looked like a suburban development, et cetera, and so the reason I bring that up is that in so many of these situations I see across the country, you have this basic property rights issue. Say, well, wait a second. The cities are gaining this ascendancy right now and pushing back and setting all these rules. But people who own the mineral rights there have a very strong case. I'm not a lawyer, but it seems to me they have a very strong case of property rights. Say, wait a second. I either purchased or inherited or something, or whatever, however I got it, but I have the mineral rights. I have the right, and this was the Otis Grimes v. Goodman case, I have the right to drill there. And if you take that away from me, if you take that right away from me, you're taking something of great value from me. So how do you balance this city increasingly gaining rights to zone the way they want to zone with the property rights? And I don't think that's been really figured out yet. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see some sort of cases, maybe even go above the state courts or go through the federal system, because that issue is still out there. And I don't have a really good answer for how do you balance that. And I can tell you, I don't think anyone has figured that out yet. But I bring up Fort Worth because sometimes the legal issues presented really take a back seat to just being able to sit down. In Fort Worth, they were able to sit down and hash out a set of rules, and lo and behold, you had quite a bit of development in the city, and frankly, it worked. Elsewhere, there's so much antagonism now that it almost doesn't matter what the rules are. Someone's going to sue, someone's going to be unhappy, and development is starting to stall out. So let's get back to our friends in Burke Burnett. just to sort of wrap up, because many of the unresolved legal issues that are being faced today were back present in Otis Grimes' day. It has it all. It has the split estate. Otis Grimes owned the surface. The previous owner owned the mineral rights. It has the nuisance claim, essentially. You know, he basically goes to court saying, I can't talk to my wife. I can't live in my house anymore. It has the setback issue. You know, one of the things he claimed was that the derrick was basically right above his house. And that was was going to fall over on his house. So Goodman, in the case, argues that what Grimes faces, the, quote, injuries complained of by the plaintiff are but those commonly sustained by the inhabitants of the town of Burke-Burnett, which essentially foresees the reasonable and customary claim that evolve in law, that you can drill where you need to and do what you need to as long as it's reasonable and customary. This is what the industry does. And that became the standard of later years. So there's the property rights issue. Mineral rights have the right to drill here. And if you deprive them of these rights, how do you compensate them for that? Well, we don't have an answer for that. We don't have that compensation answer yet. So there was a great 1963 Southwest Law Review article that I found. One of the reasons I love reporting a little on history is that I find that back then, in the past, people just wrote more colorfully and didn't seem to pull their punches quite as much as they do this right now. And so the Law Review said that the ruling of the court seems particularly harsh and demonstrates the complete indifference some courts displayed towards surface rights. However, this argument overlooks the fact that the lessees had the right and the desire to drill the well. They had given consideration and acquired the lease for the purpose of drilling and producing the oil. So, just to sort of wrap up, the nuclear power industry, after the 70s, really stops building new nuclear power plants. There are a couple here in Texas, actually, that were built in the 80s, but the process had really was rolling in the 70s. But after 3 Mile Island and the fears about that, and 3 Mile Island, for those of you who don't know, is a nuclear power plant in central Pennsylvania that didn't quite have a meltdown, but came very close to it. And it sort of scared that area stiff. The public lost faith in the nuclear power industry. And that's why we haven't built a new one to date. And my question is the public going to lose faith also in the fracking industry? To do the right thing, to be able to come in and drill a well safely, to work with neighbors. And I think that's a really open question right now. And so, just to sort of wrap up, there are really two issues kind of floating about here. There's the legal issue of, can you go in, do you have the right to go in, what kind of, how do you have to work with the neighbors, where can you drill, where can you build it, et cetera, and how can you compensate them if you're going to, as a city, take away the right to drill. But then there's this political and cultural issue too, because the legal issues might not even matter if the industry loses the public. And the public says, you know what, we didn't get into this much in this lecture, but we didn't, there's this whole issue of, well, when you drill, you're going to cause earthquakes. Well, it's not quite true. The injection wells, the wastewater wells do. But there are all these issues, earthquakes, air emissions, potential for water contamination. If you lose the public, it doesn't even matter what the legal issues are, because they're going to be an ascendancy of the ability of cities to prevent and to zone out this activity. So we've seen this incredible boom in the United States, and the boom continues. And there are a couple things that could derail the boom. One is prices. Prices fall. That's going to cause a big change. But the other thing that really could derail it is the loss of the public and the loss of confidence and not being able to really resolve these issues. So as you guys go out and graduate from law school and head out there, maybe you'll be lucky like me and get this early assignment to do something really fascinating and interesting. And one of those assignments might really be to try to figure out what the legal rules of the road are here. Because we've come a long way since Otis Grimes, but in some ways we're still stuck there. And we haven't figured out how do you balance the needs of the public with the needs of the oil and gas industry. So thank you very much. I think we're going to do some questions, but I appreciate your attention, your time.
All right, as Russell indicated, we've got some time for some questions, and just a hint, if anybody asks for the recipe for Barney fudge, I'll know you really weren't paying attention. So any questions out there for Russell? Don't be shy. Run in the back. For those at home, let me restate the question. The question is about uniformity of surface use agreements.
My experience has been no. There has been very little uniformity. It's really driven by the companies. The companies will have their own lease that they like, and the leases are slightly different. We have seen some grouping together, kind of co-ops of surface and mineral rights owners, where they'll come together, they'll hire a lawyer to try to work out something. Penn State, I know, up in Pennsylvania, did a really good job of turning their extension into a information clearinghouse. But no, there's been very little uniformity. And that's triggered a whole, I didn't even talk about this, but that's triggered a whole bunch of lawsuits about royalties. This is a whole other question. You saw, the landman comes in, he sits you down, talks a pretty nice game about how much money you're going to get and what your royalty rate is, and it's going to be 12.5% or 15%, and you're going to get all this money. And then the royalty checks start coming in, and there's this deduction for pipeline, and there's this deduction for this and that, and all of a sudden you're not getting nearly as much money. And one of the fascinating things that reporters at my paper and others have done is they go to a small area, and they find out that you can have one person with the same. All the gas is going to the same pipelines, but people are getting different prices for the gas, and that affects your royalty checks. So there was massive confusion, and that adds to the distrust out there. So in some ways, there are some people in the industry who realize and acknowledge the problems that they brought upon themselves. The problem is that there are thousands of companies out there drilling and doing this. And to try to herd even 20 companies together to come up with something like a standardized lease is difficult. Try 100. Try even 5. That's been a problem. So, I also, the last point on that, one of the reasons it's so difficult is that the companies that jumped into this are basically the old wildcatting companies. That's their heritage. They don't like to run with the crowd. They like to run away from the crowd. And I can tell you stories about people trying to get everyone together, say, okay, all of us, these 5 companies, we're all drilling the same county. Let's all get together and come up with some best practices, go out and meet with the county commissioners, and they couldn't even do that.
Here on the front.
When you were writing this book,
Mm-hmm.
did you run across, I know some issues with fracking and trespassing property lines beneath the surface. And I know Texas had a case that said that fracking is considered trespass, but then Pennsylvania had a case that basically said Texas is wrong, and fracking is trespassing, and you can kind of tell where the fracking is going to go. You run across anything like that?
Okay, so you're talking about subsurface trespassing, not surface. Oh, that's interesting. No, I'm not.
I just want to make sure the live streaming folks know the question. It has to do with fracking in the context of subsurface trespasses.
Here's what I can tell you that I did find in the course of my work. When this began, this was not a really fracking was not particularly high tech. It involved gathering up millions of gallons of water, usually several 100,000 pounds of sand, and as much horsepower as you could muster to pump this slurry into the ground to create fractures. They did not understand exactly where the fractures were going. Now, they had a pretty good idea of how far they were going. There is an incredible amount of work going on right now to put in subsurface microphones and seismographs to try to figure out where the fracking is going. But think about that. We're 10 years into this boom, and they're now just sort of getting the real good understanding of where the work is. I was down at Halliburton, which is a big service company, as you know, their labs, and they're doing a lot of this because they're trying to understand better. They're trying to maximize output and what kind of fracks can we do, how can we drive down the cost to maximize the output, et cetera. So they're approaching this from a commercial point of view. But the takeaway message for me was they're still learning by putting these seismographs and these microphones where the fracks are going. So I would not be surprised if there were some trespass going on, because I don't think the industry has a really good handle, and certainly over the first 10 years of the boom, had a really good handle on exactly where the fractures were. And if you don't know where the fractures are, you don't know what rock is providing the oil and gas that's coming up your well.
In the back? So is the question basically the PR efforts of the industry? Okay.
Yeah, a couple years ago, the CEO of Halliburton, the governor of Colorado, had the famous summit where they drank frack water, which is true. But that was driven by the fact that Halliburton had come up with what they called their new clean stim products. And it was fracking, basically, instead of using chemicals, they were using only chemicals and ingredients that were approved for use in the food industry. They came out and they pushed that, and so they sort of showed, yes, we can drink it, et cetera. Although the last time I checked on their website, there's a little disclaimer on the bottom that said this is not intended for human consumption. But there is a big effort that the industry has made to push that what they're doing is safe and that you should trust us. Now, pushing against that was the fact that most service industries were making money hand over fist supplying the chemicals. And they didn't want to let everyone on to the fact that they didn't really have incredibly sophisticated, patented, protected ingredients, recipes. So part of the reason they wanted to hide it was they didn't want to let everyone know, they didn't want to let their customers know, essentially, like, hey, we're kind of using basic stuff here, and we're charging a lot of money for it. So that's one reason why they sought protection from disclosure, but then there was so much of a pushback that they finally turned around and said, you know what, over the last few years, there's been a huge push towards full disclosure. And essentially, what they've agreed to do is, if not provide the exact recipes, this much of this chemical, this much of this chemical, they'll provide into this well, here are the basic amounts. So they can still hide and protect, essentially, their secret sauce, but also provide people who want to know with what's going on in it. That was a big deal. It has been mostly, I would say, fixed. The public seems to have moved away from that a little bit towards other concerns about fracking, but it still has the potential to jump back and hurt the industry again, I would say.
Red shirt.
Good, because I'm not a lawyer.
Okay, the question has to do with the possibility of exporting our domestic natural gas to the European Union and replacing what Russia does.
We have the resources to provide enough gas to take Russia out of its monopoly position. And once you do that, then you're in a, they're not going to be able to hold it over, they won't be able to threaten to turn off the pipelines anymore because there'll be alternative supplies. But not anytime soon. Because the only way we're going to get the gas to the EU is through liquefied natural gas plants. And we're building a couple of those export facilities. But they're incredibly expensive. You're talking about $10 billion. So in order to finance them, you have to have lockdown customers. And the first batch of LNG plants that are being planned all have customers in Asia. So we have to, we're basically booked out to 2018 building these plants for Asia. So then you'd have to pivot and turn. So you're talking years into the future before we can even begin to get any real capacity for the EU. So yes, we could, but it's really logistics that are going to hold that up.
I think we've reached that bewitching hour where people have to start making it to their next class. So please help me thank Russell Gold.
Thank you. Thank you.
stay after, meet Russell in the lobby. He'll sell you and sign you a book. And watch your calendars for our next lecture will be on October 27th.
That went well. It was my first